Hi friends, welcome back to Talevora. He started with very little, faced repeated failures, financial struggles, and moments when his dreams seemed almost impossible. Yet the man who once struggled to keep his small animation company alive would eventually create characters, stories, and an entertainment empire that would become famous around the world. This is the remarkable true story of Walt Disney, a journey of imagination, failure, determination, and a dream that refused to disappear. Walt Disney's story began on December 5, 1901, when Walter Elias Disney was born in Chicago, Illinois. He was born into a working-class family, and his childhood was far removed from the enormous entertainment empire that would one day carry his name. His father, Elias Disney, worked in different businesses to support the family, while his mother, Flora, cared for Walt and his siblings. When Walt was still young, the family moved away from Chicago and eventually settled on a farm near Marceline, Missouri. It was there that some of Walt's strongest childhood memories were formed. The small town, the countryside, animals, trains, farms, and people around him became part of the imagination that would influence his creative life. Walt was fascinated by drawing from an early age. While other children were playing, he often found ways to sketch the things he saw around him. His interest in art was not initially viewed as the path to a great career, but Walt continued drawing because he genuinely enjoyed it. He eventually began selling small drawings and sketches to people around him, discovering that his artistic ability could have practical value. His teenage years were also filled with ambition. Walt wanted to become an artist, but he did not have an easy path toward professional success. He attended school while continuing to practice drawing, and he became interested in newspapers, illustration, photography, and eventually animation. When he was still a teenager, Walt tried to join the military during the First World War. Because he was too young to enlist normally, he found another way to participate by joining the American Red Cross as an ambulance driver. He was sent to France after the war had ended, so he did not experience combat in the way he had originally expected. Nevertheless, the experience exposed him to another part of the world and gave him memories that stayed with him. After returning to the United States, Walt decided to pursue commercial art. He worked at different advertising and art companies, where he learned about illustration and basic animation techniques. These jobs were not glamorous, but they gave him practical experience. Walt began to understand that animation could become more than a simple novelty. He believed drawings could be brought to life and used to tell stories. That idea became increasingly important to him. Walt eventually moved to Kansas City, where he met another young artist who would become one of the most important people in his career, Ub Iwerks. The two shared an interest in animation and began working together. They experimented with short animated films and eventually started their own small company. Their first attempts were far from the polished productions that would later make Disney famous. They had limited money, basic equipment, and little business experience. But Walt was determined to continue. He and his team created short animated films and tried to sell them to distributors. For a while, things seemed to be moving in the right direction, but the business was fragile. Walt often spent more money creating films than the company was able to earn. Eventually, the company failed. For many people, that might have been the moment to give up. Walt did not. He had experienced his first major business failure, but he still believed in animation. With very little money, he decided to leave Kansas City and go to Hollywood. He arrived in California with ambition but without a successful company behind him. Hollywood was becoming the center of the American film industry, and Walt believed it could provide the opportunity he needed. He joined his brother Roy Disney, who would become his closest business partner. Together, the the brothers created the Disney Brothers Studio. Walt focused heavily on creative work while Roy helped manage the financial and business side. Their partnership would become one of the foundations of everything that followed. In the early days, they worked in a small studio and faced constant financial pressure. Walt was obsessed with improving animation. He wanted characters to feel alive rather than simply moving across a screen. He wanted audiences to connect emotionally with drawings. The studio began producing animated shorts and experimenting with new techniques. Walt's ambition kept growing. He was not satisfied with simply making cartoons. He wanted animation to become a serious form of storytelling. The young company slowly gained attention, and Walt began creating new characters and stories. But success was still uncertain. Every project required money, workers, equipment, and time. One failed production could put the entire company in danger. Walt repeatedly pushed forward despite these risks. He also became known for demanding high standards from his artists. He wanted every movement, expression, and scene to look better than what audiences had seen before. This ambition sometimes created tension within the studio, but it also pushed the team to innovate. Then came one of the most important moments of Walt's early career. He created a character called Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. The character became popular, and Walt believed he had finally found something that could make his studio successful. But Walt soon discovered a painful lesson about the entertainment business. The rights to Oswald belonged to the distributor, not to Walt himself. When Walt tried to negotiate better terms, he discovered that he had less control over his creation than he had believed. Several of the artists who worked with him also left to work for the distributor. Walt had lost a successful character and some members of his own team. It was another devastating setback. But once again, Walt refused to stop. During the train journey back to California, he began thinking about creating a completely new character, one that he would own and control. That idea would eventually lead to the character that changed his life forever. A small mouse would soon become the center of Walt Disney's future, but at this moment, Walt was still a struggling young producer trying to rebuild his company after another major failure. The loss of Oswald could have ended Walt Disney's ambitions, but instead it forced him to start again. Walt and his team began developing a new character, a small mouse who would eventually become known as Mickey Mouse. The character was created through the combined creative work of Walt Disney and UB Iwerks, while Walt provided the voice of Mickey in the early years. Mickey was not an immediate worldwide phenomenon. Walt had to find a way to make audiences notice the character, and that meant experimenting with animation and sound. In 1928, the studio released Steamboat Willie, a short animated film featuring Mickey Mouse that became a major breakthrough. One of the important reasons for its success was its effective use of synchronized sound. Audiences were fascinated by the combination of animation, music, sound effects, and character movement. Mickey quickly became popular, and the Disney studio began receiving much more attention. But Walt did not stop with Mickey. He believed animation could become a serious storytelling medium. During the following years, the studio continued producing animated shorts and developing new characters. Walt pushed his artists to improve the quality of animation, movement, music, and storytelling. The studio became known for experimenting with techniques that were still new to the industry. This ambition created financial pressure. Producing high-quality animation was expensive and time-consuming. Walt repeatedly invested money into projects because he believed that better animation would attract larger audiences. His brother Roy often had to deal with the financial consequences of these decisions. decisions. Roy's role was extremely important because he helped keep the company financially alive while Walt concentrated on creative ideas. The brothers had different strengths, but together they created a powerful partnership. As the studio grew, Walt began thinking about something that many people considered extremely risky: making a full-length animated feature film. At that time, animated shorts were common, but a feature-length animated movie was a completely different challenge. It would require years of work and enormous amounts of money. Many people in the film industry believed audiences would never sit through an entire animated movie. Some people even mocked Walt's idea and called the project Disney's folly. Walt, however, believed that animation could create emotions just as effectively as live-action cinema. He wanted the audience to care about the characters, feel tension, laugh, and even cry. The project he chose was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The production became one of the biggest risks of his career. Artists worked for years on the film. The studio developed new animation techniques and spent enormous amounts of money. Walt personally reviewed many details and pushed his artists to make the characters more expressive and believable. The project became so expensive that Walt and Roy needed additional financial support to keep production going. Walt's determination sometimes placed enormous pressure on the people around him. He demanded quality and often rejected work that he believed was not good enough. But the long hours and intense effort eventually produced something remarkable. When Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was released in 1937, the reaction was extraordinary. Audiences embraced the film, and it became a major commercial success. The movie proved that a feature-length animated film could work. It also established Disney as a major force in the film industry. The success of Snow White gave Walt the financial resources and confidence to continue producing ambitious projects. The studio expanded and began working on new animated films such as Pinocchio, Fantasia, Dumbo, and Bambi. These productions demonstrated how quickly Disney animation was developing. Each film had its own style, characters, music, and emotional story. Walt wanted animation to create worlds that audiences could remember long after leaving the theater. But success did not mean that everything became easy. The studio continued facing financial problems, especially because animation required enormous production costs. Then the Second World War affected the company and the wider film industry. International markets were disrupted, and some Disney films could not perform as expected in Europe. The studio also became involved in producing training and propaganda films for the United States government during the war. The war years were difficult, and Walt's company experienced financial strain. Walt himself became increasingly interested in ideas beyond traditional animated films. He began imagining a place where families could experience entertainment outside the cinema. He wanted to create something completely different, a large, clean, organized environment where parents and children could spend an entire day together. The idea eventually became Disneyland. At first, many people considered the idea unrealistic. Building such a place would require huge amounts of money, planning, construction, and organization. But Walt continued developing the concept. He studied amusement parks and thought about what he believed they were missing. He wanted Disneyland to feel like an experience rather than simply a collection of rides. Different areas would have different themes, stories, buildings, characters, and attractions. Walt's vision was becoming increasingly ambitious. He wanted visitors to step into worlds they had previously only seen on screens. Meanwhile, television was becoming increasingly popular in American homes. Walt recognized that television could become another way to reach audiences. He entered the television industry and developed programs that helped promote Disney's films and future projects. projects. Television also allowed Walt to speak directly to audiences and introduce them to the idea of Disneyland. As the project developed, construction finally began in Anaheim, California. The work was enormous. Roads, buildings, attractions, landscaping, transportation systems, restaurants, and themed environments all had to be created. Walt visited the construction site regularly and closely followed the progress. He wanted every part of the park to fit the larger vision. On July 17, 1955, Disneyland officially opened. The opening was a major event broadcast on television to millions of viewers. The park immediately became one of the most recognizable entertainment destinations in the world. Walt had once again taken an idea that many people considered unrealistic and turned it into reality. But even after Disneyland opened, Walt continued dreaming. He was already thinking about another project that would become even more ambitious. He wanted to create a planned city of the future, a place where technology, transportation, architecture, and community life could be integrated into one experimental environment. The project would eventually be known as Epcot. Walt imagined a future that looked very different from the world around him. But before he could fully develop that vision, his health began to decline. The man who had spent decades turning impossible ideas into reality was approaching the final chapter of his life. The final years of Walt Disney's life were marked by the same quality that had defined him from the beginning. He continued to imagine things that did not yet exist. Even after the success of Disneyland, he was not satisfied with simply maintaining what he had already built. He wanted to create something even larger and more ambitious. His idea for Epcot, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow, reflected his fascination with the future. Walt imagined a planned community where new technologies, modern transportation, architecture, and innovative ideas could be tested in everyday life. It was a very different concept from Disneyland. Disneyland was designed primarily as an entertainment destination, while Epcot was imagined as an experiment in how people might live in the future. Walt continued working on the idea, but his health was becoming a serious concern. In 1966, doctors discovered that he had lung cancer. Walt had been a heavy smoker for many years, and the disease had progressed significantly. Despite his condition, he continued thinking about his projects and remained interested in the future of his company. On December 15, 1966, Walt Disney died in Burbank, California, at the age of 65. His death marked the end of the life of one of the most influential figures in entertainment history. But the story did not end there. The company he had built continued developing the ideas he had started. Disneyland remained open, animated films continued to be produced, and his plans for the future were carried forward by the people who had worked with him. One of the most important projects connected to his final vision eventually became Walt Disney World in Florida. Walt himself did not live to see it open. In 1971, several years after his death, Walt Disney World officially opened in Florida. The project became another enormous success and eventually developed into one of the world's most famous entertainment destinations. The Epcot concept also changed after Walt's death. Instead of becoming exactly the experimental city he had originally imagined, Epcot eventually became a theme park at Walt Disney World, combining ideas about technology, international cultures, education, and entertainment. Walt's original vision had evolved, but his fascination with the future remained part of the Disney identity. His legacy also continued through animation. The characters and stories created by Disney became familiar to generations of children and adults around the world. Mickey Mouse became one of the most recognizable fictional characters ever created. Disney Disney animated films became a major part of popular culture, and the company continued developing new characters, stories, and technologies long after Walt was gone. But Walt Disney's greatest legacy was perhaps not one particular character or film. It was the belief that an idea that seemed impossible could become real if someone was willing to work for it. His life had included repeated failures. His first animation company collapsed. He lost control of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. He faced enormous financial pressure while making Snow White. He risked his company's future to build Disneyland. And even when people criticized his ideas, he continued moving forward. His career was therefore not a simple story of success. It was a story of failure followed by persistence. One of the most important lessons from Walt's life is that his imagination was connected to action. He did not simply dream about making animated characters. He built a studio. He did not simply imagine a theme park. He found investors, hired workers, studied existing parks, and built Disneyland. He did not simply talk about the future. He began planning Epcot. His ideas became powerful because he repeatedly tried to turn them into reality. His relationship with his brother Roy was also central to the story. Walt was the creative dreamer, while Roy was more focused on business and finance. Their differences sometimes created tension, but their partnership allowed the company to survive. Without Roy's financial management and business discipline, many of Walt's ambitious ideas might never have become reality. Their combined strengths helped transform a small animation operation into a major entertainment company. Walt's story also had complicated sides. He could be demanding, extremely ambitious, and difficult for some employees to work with. He expected very high standards and often pushed people hard. His personal and professional relationships were not always simple. Understanding these aspects is important because real people are more complicated than the legends built around them. Walt Disney was neither simply a perfect dreamer nor merely a businessman. He was a complicated person whose ambition, creativity, persistence, and leadership produced an enormous cultural impact. From a young boy drawing pictures to a man whose company would influence generations, his life followed an extraordinary path. He started with a pencil and an imagination. He faced poverty, business failures, financial problems, criticism, and uncertainty. Yet he continued creating. His greatest strength may have been his willingness to begin again after failure. When one company failed, he started another. When he lost Oswald, he created Mickey Mouse. When people doubted feature-length animation, he made Snow White. When people doubted Disneyland, he built it. And when he imagined a future community, he began planning Epcot. Each time, the pattern was similar: an idea, doubt from others, enormous obstacles, and then relentless effort. That pattern became the foundation of his legacy. Today, the name Walt Disney is recognized around the world. His company has expanded far beyond the small studio he once operated with his brother. Disney Animation, theme parks, television, films, characters, and stories have become part of global popular culture. Millions of people have visited places inspired by his ideas, watched stories created by his company, and grown up with characters that originated during his lifetime. Yet behind all of that is the story of one man who started with a simple love for drawing and storytelling. Walt Disney's life reminds us that success does not always begin with wealth, connections, or certainty. Sometimes it begins with a skill that seems small, a dream that seems unrealistic, and the decision to keep going after things go wrong. His journey from a young artist to the creator of one of the world's most influential entertainment companies was filled with both achievement and struggle. He did not live long enough to see everything his imagination would eventually become, but the work he started continued far beyond his lifetime. The boy who once drew pictures of the world around him eventually helped create create worlds that millions of people would visit through films, television, and theme parks. And perhaps that is the most remarkable part of Walt Disney's story. He spent his life turning imagination into something other people could experience. He faced failure, but he did not allow failure to become the final chapter. He faced doubt, but he continued building. And although Walt Disney died in 1966, the ideas he spent his life developing continued to grow. His story was ultimately not just about cartoons or theme parks. It was about imagination, persistence, risk, and the courage to pursue an idea even when other people could not yet see what you saw. That was the journey of Walt Disney, a man who started with a pencil, faced repeated setbacks, and eventually helped change the world of entertainment forever.